So this particular story we're reading today has been turned into a famous opera. So what do we know about him? What can we say as context? Since we haven't read any of his stories before, right? This is a new author to us. What can you tell me about him? Right, he's German, yes? Okay. So we saw the German Romanticism was the earliest of the Romantic movements, right? Not the first Romantics, but the first Romantic movement, right? And we saw that it tended to be very, very emotional, that side of melodramatic, that side of the German Romanticism, right? Very passionate. That's why the earliest of the movements was known as Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress. You know, it's like this melodramatic style, right? Over the top passion, right? Anything else? Anything else you can tell me about him? When was this story published? 1817, right? So it's a little bit earlier than some of the other stories we've been looking at too, isn't it? Right? Because remember, most of our stories have tended to come from the 1830s and 1840s, most of them. Whereas this particular story, a little bit earlier, 1817. Right? Okay, and of course he's influenced by what movement? Romanticism. That's always the same question, same answer to that question. Right, so we have here this guy, E.T.A. Hoffmann, and one of the other features of his stories is that, remember I told you in our introduction to Romanticism that one of the influences upon the Romantics was that they revived the Gothic style of storytelling, right? And because the Gothic style was very fashionable in the late 18th century, so the late 1700s. And then it sort of went out of fashion and became uncool for a while, right? It became sort of, you know, too much of a cliche. Everyone sort of knew the plots and knew the styles and knew the ways in which these stories were written. And so they became unfashionable for a while, but then when the Romantics came along, they gave the Gothic genre, the Gothic style, a whole new, different way of looking and telling these kinds of stories. So we've already seen this in other writers as well, particularly like something like The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, where we had a very Gothic sort of style, and we have the same thing recurring here. Right. How is this story told? It starts as letters, doesn't it? Right? And it's almost kind of deliberately confusing, isn't it? Because you sort of think, oh, the whole story is going to be these letters, isn't it? So the letters, 3 letters that open the story, right? They start off as one style, and then what does it jump to? Not quite.
Kind of telling a story about somebody else.
Right, so it does speak in the first person voice, but really it's more of a third person narration because the person who is the first person narrator is not really involved directly in the story, right? So even though he's friends with Nathaniel and the other characters in there, he's really more of an outside observer, right? So it kind of blends together different styles of voices. So we have the found objects, as we called them, of the letters, right? And we saw that this was an early strategy of the novel, was to present us with these things that say, oh, I just found these letters, oh, I just found this diary. You should read it, it's really cool, right? So it begins with the letters, and then we jump to this, what seems at first to be first person narration, and it is, but it is from someone who's kind of outside of the story. He's not involved with the characters all that directly in terms of what happens in the story. Okay. So this also is somewhat different to the styles that we've seen in the other stories. Okay, let's quickly go over then what happens in our text and make sure we all know and understand what is occurring here. All right. Now, one of the things to understand about this story is that, particularly the character of Nathaniel, he's very unreliable as a character, right? He makes all sorts of assumptions about reality that, of course, turn out to be not true. And in fact, having read this story a number of times, each time I come back to read it, particularly the scenes with the woman that he falls in love with, Olympia, they get funnier every time that I read them because it's so bizarre the way in which he falls in love with her. Anyway, so we begin with the first letter from Nathaniel to Lothair, and we don't know at all who these people are, do we? Like, we have no idea of their connection. We just know that they're, from the letter, that they seem to be friends. Okay. And of course, he also mentions Clara, who is mentioned as Lothair's sister. Okay. So he talks about how he had a visitor, basically a guy who was going around door to door selling like glasses, right? And he freaks out, right, when he sees the seller, and then he's like, I couldn't really understand why my reaction was so strange to this guy. All he was doing was just an innocent guy coming around selling glasses and telescopes and stuff, and then I remembered back to my childhood, right? He remembers back to his childhood and about his father and how his father would tell these stories about the Sandman, right? And the Sandman that would come and like put you to sleep, right? And this was the story that he would say to you to get his children to go to bed, right? The Sandman's going to come and put you to sleep. And so in the mind of Nathaniel as a young boy, he has this association of the Sandman as being this horrible monster that cuts him off from his parents and forces him to go to bed. And so he becomes, he forms this desire to actually see the Sandman. So he creeps downstairs one night, hides behind hides himself, and then he sees this character of Coppelius, right, who seems to be his father's partner, maybe even by his behavior sounds like he's lending the family money, right, which is why they treat him in such a sort of subservient way. And so he sees this guy, Coppelius, and he's horrified by him. He sees the way that he treats his father, the way in which his father is very subservient to this ugly man. And so he has this association immediately. He thinks that this guy, Coppelius, as a boy, like when he's a boy, he thinks that he must be this monstrous Sandman who comes to put him to sleep. Right. We then learn about what happens to his family, right? That there's an explosion. One of the experiments that Coppelius and Nathaniel's father were doing goes wrong, and his father dies, and Coppelius disappears, never to be seen again. So at the end of that letter, we are then told that now that Nathaniel has gone away to do his studies, he met someone who has a name that's sort of vaguely like Coppelius, right? And it's a guy who sells glasses whose name is Giuseppe Coppola, right? So Coppelius, Coppola, their names are vaguely similar, and so he comes to associate the two of them even though they're actually two different people, right? And of course one of them is German and one of them is Italian, so they're completely different backgrounds. So he sends off this letter to Lothair, and then we find out from the next letter, which is from Clara to Nathaniel, that actually he accidentally addressed it to Clara instead of Lothair. And so he sent it to his friend's sister, who of course we find out is romantically attached to. And she says, look, you accidentally sent me your letter. I started reading it, and then I realized, oh, this was addressed to my brother, but I couldn't help but read it. And then she gives him a sort of a very sensible talk about how, you know, the dark things that we imagine in our mind, often they're the products of our own dark side, right, of our own bad things in our own mind. And so if we just like pay attention to reality and ignore the fantasies, the dark fantasies, then they have no power over us, right? And so she advises that he does the same thing in this case with this guy Giuseppe Coppola, and all the fantasies that he has about him being the Sandman or being Coppelius returned in a different form will go away. And then we then have a letter, the third letter from Nathaniel to Lothair, in which he tells about how he's trying to take Clara's advice, right? And also about how he has met this woman, Olympia, who is the daughter of his professor, right? And how she is very beautiful, but also a little bit strange. Okay. All right. So it's at that point, right, on page 101, that we jump. We have this switch in the narrative. We have these three letters, and then suddenly this new narrator comes in and tells us that he is going to fill in the story for us. Right? So, of course, he gives us more background as to who these people are and how they're connected. So we learn, of course, that they are distant relatives of each other, right? So Clara and Lothair, they're brother and sister, and they're distant relatives of Nathaniel, and that they had lost their parents around the same time that Nathaniel's father had died, and so Nathaniel's family had taken them in, and that this had led to like sort of Clara and Nathaniel growing up together and eventually falling in love, and they've got plans to get married after he finishes his studies. Okay. The narrator then, it's sort of important from the storytelling point of view, he gives us all these different ways in which he's going to try and begin his story, right? Like he wants to, sometimes he thinks, I'll start it in this really melodramatic way, and then I'll try this. No, that sounds fake, right? And then he's like, I'll just show you the letters, right? Okay, so then he then talks about these different characters. He talks about Clara in particular, talks about how she is this very calm, rational, sensible, not classically beautiful woman, but attractive in particular because she has this very solid character. Right? So she could be mistaken for being sort of, boring or in some sort of way, but it's because she has this different character that she says, if you really know what you're talking about, you really know what you want in a woman, then she is quite an interesting woman. Let's see. We then see that Nathaniel, even though he wants to take Clara's advice about ignoring the evil influences, nonetheless, he is disturbed by the appearance of Coppola, and he starts having all of these like sort of mystical philosophies that he gets involved in, right? All these like weird sort of conspiracy theories about like the devil and higher principles and all this sort of stuff. Right? In other words, he kind of transforms himself into the very sort of typical romantic misfit protagonist, right? And so he keeps on going on about all of these ideas to Clara, and she's like, this is nonsense. Why are you telling me this stuff? But he's really obsessed with it. He starts writing this poem, for example, in which he imagines the Sandman coming and as Coppelius and standing between him and Clara, and he writes this epic poem about it that he wants to show to her. So this sort of creates problems between the two lovers. And so he sort of shows her his work, shows her his poetry, talks about his ideas, and she's like, this is nonsense, right? This is just, the rantings of a crazy person. And so he gets mad at her, and he says that she doesn't have any feelings. She's like a robot. She's not like an automaton. And he sort of gets quite annoyed with her. So after his visit, Nathaniel returns back to the city where he is studying at university, right? And he finds that the building where he was living burned down, but that thankfully his friends had rescued all of his books and writings and belongings and stuff, and they transferred them to a new place, except that this new place looks right into the home of his professor, right? Which is a bit, as a professor, it's a bit weird and creepy. Nonetheless, his place looks into the professor's, through the professor's window, and through there he can see the figure of what he is told is the daughter of the Professor Spallanzani. It's his daughter Olympia, right? We then see that he's visited by Coppola, who is selling eyeglasses, and right, he takes out he's like, can I sell you something? Like, look, I have all these glasses, and he starts pulling them out of his pockets, like, these ones would be good for you, these ones, and he's like, I have telescopes, I have binoculars, I have everything, right? And so, at first, Nathaniel, because of his past traumas, is a little sort of freaked out by this, but then he determines that he's going to follow Clara's advice, and he's like, no, look, instead of freaking out, I'll buy a telescope from this guy, right? And so he takes one, looks through the window, he can see Olympia up close, and he's like, yep, I'll take this one, right? And then sends Coppola on his way, right? Now then he receives an invitation to the professor's place. The professor is holding this great big party. He's invited most of the university to come to it, including Nathaniel. And it's supposed to be the debut, the social debut of his daughter Olympia. And Nathaniel goes along to it, and he sees Olympia, and he thinks, oh, this woman, she's so beautiful. And he sits there all night, he dances with her, he gets her to play the piano, she does all these other things with him, talks to her all night, and he can't work out why he's the only one that seems to be interested in this apparently perfect woman, right? But nonetheless, he continues to be obsessed with her. He then starts to imagine that maybe some of the other students, some of his friends like Siegmund, are jealous, right? And so he sort of has this conversation with his friend, like, look, this Olympia woman, I know she's really gorgeous, but you can't have her. I saw her first. And his friend is like, no, you can have her. Right? No, believe me, it's fine. I'm not interested. She's amazing. I'm not sure what you see in her, but you have her. Right? And so Nathaniel becomes more and more obsessed to the point where he hints to the Professor Spallanzani that he wants to marry his daughter. Right? And so he goes over there to propose, right, to make this proposal. He wants to marry Olympia, and he's horrified to hear these sounds, and then he bursts in on this scene where the Coppola and Spallanzani, the professor, are fighting over the body of Olympia, right? They're both holding her by one end to the other, they're pulling her, right? And eventually Coppola manages to wrench the body free, and he smacks the professor with it, and then he throws it over his shoulder, and he runs out. And he notices that the eyes from Olympia are missing. They're still on the floor, and the professor picks them up and throws the eyes at him and says, go get her! Don't let him get away! That's my robot, right? So Nathaniel, when he hears about all this, right, he freaks out again, which seems to be his main role in this story, and he's put in the madhouse. He's committed as a crazy person. Okay. Now, eventually, well, at first, after all this, everyone sort of says, oh yeah, I knew she was a robot all along. I knew she was an automaton. Yeah, of course. Even though they didn't really. But Nathaniel, he eventually recovers from his madness. He gets sent home. He's nursed back to health by Clara, right? And things seem to be looking up, right? Things seem to be going better. And they inherit some money. And so with the money that they have, they decide to buy a country estate. They're going to move to somewhere nicer. And so on their way, they're on this way to this new town, and they see a tower, and they're like, hey, let's go up and see what's at the top of the tower. And so Clara and Nathaniel go up, and she's like, oh, what's that thing over there? And he takes out his eyeglass, right? Takes out his telescope, and he suddenly freaks out again, because what he actually sees is Coppelius, or at least it's what he imagines that he sees. Right, so he thinks he sees Coppelius. He freaks out. He thinks that he starts to believe that Clara is just like Olympia, that she is a robot, and he starts to try to pick her up and throw her off the tower. Right, her brother runs up, rescues her, and then Nathaniel throws himself off and dies. And then the story finishes with Clara. We find that eventually, having broken her ties with Nathaniel, has actually seemed to have found someone who is much better suited to her, that she is happy, that she's married, that she has a couple of children, that she's living a peaceful, happy life instead of the life that she might have had with Nathaniel. All right. So it's a very complicated, very in-depth sort of story, lots of weird twists, lots of strange things that happen in the course of the story. But of course, these are all reflective both of these romantic ideas, but also quite similar to what we see with Washington Irving in his stories. It's also kind of poking fun at the romantic character, right? Particularly like that sort of misfit, oh, I'm so misunderstood, I'm so passionate, sort of artistic type that Nathaniel is. It's kind of making fun of him at the same time. All right. So let's look at some of the contextual things here that Hoffman is using in order to understand both some of the historical things and, of course, some of the symbols and so on, and then we'll turn to our prep sheets. So first of all, of course, the figure of the Sandman is not something that Hoffman invents himself, right? And we've seen other authors use particularly stories from folklore, from fairy tales, those sorts of things. So think, for example, for Rip Van Winkle, right? When we have the fairy tales, the German fairy tales and so on that are recycled and reused by romantic authors. Here we have the E.T.A. Hoffman doing the same sort of thing, right? So this figure of the Sandman, when you wake up sometimes and you have you sort of have a bit of grit in the corners of your eyes, right? You know that feeling, right? This is where that sort of that mythology comes from, right? Is the idea that there's a Sandman and he throws sand in your eyes and it makes you magic sand that makes you fall asleep, so that when you wake up, you can feel, oh, that's from where the Sandman threw some sand in my eyes from his magic bucket or whatever. So the Sandman has this medieval folklore kind of figure, right? Usually, though, in this particular story, the Sandman is presented to us as being sort of evil and monstrous and bad, whereas usually the Sandman in most of these folk tales is actually kind of a benevolent, good figure, right? It's nice to fall asleep. It's not good to have insomnia, so usually he's sort of a kind sort of figure, whereas in this story, Hoffman transforms him into something much more threatening and much more scary. Okay. Now, of course, today we're still, developing artificial intelligence, robots, electronic things, and so on, right? And is there a realistic kind of robot that exists today? I mean, there are some that like particularly the Japanese have been at the forefront of developing these kinds of like real-life, realistic sort of robots. But one of the problems that continually arises with those things is there's what's called the Uncanny Valley, which means that there's a certain element of cuteness that arises when you start to replicate human beings. So like, think of like a cartoon, right? Cartoons are kind of cute, right? The characters that they create. But at some point, when you start to get closer and closer to what a real human being looks like, right, in your representations, whether if it's, say, a robot, then it starts to become weird and creepy, right? So if you've seen some of those like Japanese robots, like when the robot is switched off and like sitting there in a chair like this, it looks like a corpse. It looks like a dead person, doesn't it? Right? And you're sort of like, oh, this is weird. Right? So this idea of making robots today is not a new idea. And in fact, even up to 500 years ago, there were people who were trying to create machines, different kinds of machines that would replicate human behaviors that you could use to trick people into thinking that they were like real, like human beings. And one of the most famous ones is the one that you can see in the picture here. This was built in 1770, right? So like almost 50 years before this story takes place. It was burned in a fire in about the middle of the 19th century. So it lasted for about 80 or 90 years before it was accidentally destroyed. And it's called the Turk because this here, of course, is just like, it's just a model. It's not really, obviously, a real human being. But there are all of these mechanisms in here. And what you see here, this is a little cushion. And someone would sit in here, right? And what the automaton, what this robot would do, was it could play, the person in here could move the arms and eyes and so on, and it could play a game of chess against you, right? And so this was taken around all famous places in Europe, all around different courts and different princes and so on who played chess against the Turk, right? And they would hire like famous chess players to come and sit in here, and it won a lot of the time, right? The Turk would win a lot of matches, so it was a very successful automaton. And so this is one of those early attempts to do this. So you can see this is not just something that Hoffman is making up like sort of science fiction, right? This is something that people were actually doing at this time, this kind of experiment, right? There's actually a story by Edgar Allan Poe called Bezels, Chess Player, the guy who bought this Turk, and he tells a story about how people playing against this figure, right, and how they couldn't work out how to beat it. Okay. So here's this picture here in the about 30 years ago in the 1980s. Someone tried to, because the original was destroyed, he rebuilt it, right? So this is his reenactment of the Turk machine, right? So this whole thing of automatons or robots, right? Even though we think of that as being something that is entirely modern, is that actually something that people in this time period were first sort of trying to do, right? First doing relatively successful. I mean, you could obviously see that guy does not look real, but we have to sort of take our minds back 200 years and think, if you're playing against this guy and you're losing a chess game against him, you're starting to think, this is kind of freaky. This is kind of weird that I can lose against him in this way. So because in the last couple of decades, of course, there's been like great advances in artificial intelligence. And so you may have heard, for instance, of Deep Blue, which is the first computer chess playing program to beat a human being, right? So because of that kind of new technology, people have been going back to things like the Turk and saying, oh, this is where these ideas started from. So the robot woman that the professor creates in this story, right, is meant to be another kind of automaton, right, another kind of robot that he has created. And you can see this is why it dances perfectly, right? All of its movements are all mechanical. It plays the piano perfectly, and it can only say very limited things because, right, it doesn't have any real speech functions, right? Yes. Okay. Now, a second theme that we can see arising out of this, and one that is really becomes quite prominent in a lot of romantic fiction, is that of what's called the double, or we've borrowed this word from German of the doppelganger, right? They both mean exactly the same thing, and even though it's a German word, it's become appropriated into English, right? This photo here, or this still here, is from a great 80s movie called Dead Ringers by the Canadian director David Cronenberg. It's actually Jeremy Irons. There's not two Jeremy Irons in the world, but they look like he's one actor playing twins in this movie. Very weird movie as well. Anyway, so this theme of the double or the doppelganger is something that we'll come across again in some of our other short stories, particularly our last story, William Wilson. And we've already seen from, think about our second exam question, midterm exam question about those conflicting values, right? One of the ways in which the romantics tend to use this is that if you think of, let's say you have opposite values like good and evil, right? One of the ways in which you can symbolize that and explore that idea in a story is to have two characters that are exactly the same, but one is good and one is evil, for instance, right? And so this idea of the double or the doppelganger often gets used to explore those opposite contradictory sort of ideas in romantic fiction, right? So in this particular case, it's a little bit different because we have the way in which Nathaniel constantly sees the world is that he has these illusions, right? These fake visions of things in which he confuses different characters by projecting his own fears and his own desires upon them. So we have the childhood fear of Coppelius, right? His father's associate. And then later on when he's an adult, he sees Giuseppe Coppola, right? They're not the same person. He even speaks to other people who know Coppola, right? To the professor, for example, and he finds out, this guy Coppola is Italian, not German. His name is Coppola, not Coppelius, right? So, but nonetheless, he keeps on confusing the two of them, right? And treating them as though they are the same figure, as though they are doubles of each other, even though he knows logically that they're separate and different people, right? So the story itself uses this doubling a lot, and as we'll see in my last point, it sort of asks us to compare different things too through this strategy. So particularly comparing Olympia with Clara as well. Okay. So this double or doppelganger, this use of this device becomes prominent in romantic fiction. Now, one of the other ways in which Hoffman uses this idea of the double or the doppelganger is that he uses it for an idea of what's inside ourselves as to oppose what's outside of ourselves, right? It's almost like we create our own inner imagination of reality, and then there's the reality that's actually outside of us, right? So there's the imaginary monster, for instance, that Nathaniel believes that he sees compared to the actual figures who are actually outside of him. And so beginning on page 99 of our book, Clara makes this speech, right, in which she talks about how like there are these two different sides to us. Our inside, right, our inner thoughts, our inner perceptions, our subjective view of reality compared to the objective outside view, and that how we have to, if we're going to be healthy, we have to maintain a proper perspective on what is inside and what is outside. Don't just project your own desires and your own fears onto the world. So she says there on, like I said, page 99, if there is a dark and hostile power which traitorously fixes a thread in our hearts in order that, laying hold of it and drawing us by means of it along a dangerous road to ruin which otherwise we should not have trod, if I say there is such a power, it must assume within us a form like ourselves. Nay, it must be ourselves. For only in that way can we believe in it, and only so understood do we yield to it so far that it is able to accomplish its secret purpose. So long as we have sufficient firmness, fortified by cheerfulness to always acknowledge foreign influences for what they really are, whilst we quietly pursue the path pointed out to us by both inclination and calling, then this mysterious power perishes in its futile struggles to attain the form which is to be the reflected image of ourselves. It is also certain, Luther adds, that if we have once voluntarily given ourselves up to this dark physical power, it often produces within us the strange forms which the outer world throws in our way, so that thus it is we ourselves who engender within ourselves the spirit which by some remarkable delusion we imagine to speak in that outer form. It is the phantom of our own self whose intimate relationship with and whose powerful influence upon our soul either plunges us into hell or elevates us to heaven. So what he's basically saying here is, right, that we have to be very careful because sometimes the evil things that we imagine in the world are actually the projections of our own fear, right? They're just things that we have projected onto the world. And think about like some of the other stories that we've had that have looked at the world in this sort of way. Think of young Goodman Brown, for example, right? Where he sees the world as being this very dark, pessimistic, cynical, sinful sort of place. But it seems to be mostly because of his bad experience that he sees the world in this way, right? It's a projection of his own inside, right? And so what Lothair says is, well, you could also have the opposite. You can also, if you know how to think and to have a healthy mind, you can also create for yourself a good world, right? If you think healthy thoughts and you project them and you create your reality in accordance with things that are good and healthy, you can create a happy life for yourself, right? So he's saying it's almost like you could choose, right? Your positive attitude or your negative attitude is going to determine how you see the world and how you experience life. So there is this kind of doubling. What you see inside is kind of double what you see outside. Now, of course, some of the key symbols that we have in this story, obviously one of the central ones is that of the eyes, right? So in the story, it's one of the things that is translated as perspective. Basically, it means like a telescope, right? It has an ability to see over distances. This scene here is from the opera version, right? And you can see that this is Coppelius showing off all of his eyeglasses that he has concealed in his coat. Right? And we've already seen the eye used a number of times as a symbol by other romantic authors. We think of the Telltale Heart, right? There was the old man's vulture eye, in which the eye was the symbol of sometimes of his conscience, right? Also of the ability to see and to know things, right? And then also think of the elixir of life, right? When Don Juan, remember, he tests out the elixir to see if it actually works so he just dabbed a little bit on his father's eye, right? And remember, his father's eye suddenly comes back to life, and he's like, oh, this is creepy, and he squashes out the eye, kills it. Right? So of course, the eye, it's recycled here. Does Nathaniel really see the things that he thinks that he sees? Is Olympia really a living woman that he can fall in love with? She's not, is she? Is Coppola really the same person as Coppelius? No. Does he really see Coppelius when he's up there on the tower in the last scene? Right? So there's all these things that he thinks, he imagines, that he hallucinates that he sees, right? But that actually turn out to be false, turn out to be a false perception, right? That his imagination is so powerful, right, that it prevents him from actually seeing the true reality of what is out there. Okay. And then to finish the lecture part, I also want to look at the way in which this kind of story begins a process of rethinking the way in which literature, and particularly this kind of romantic, kind of Gothic literature, tends to portray women. Right? Now, next story too really rethinks the ideas about certain ideas about gender. So, in a lot, particularly if you go back and you read like the Gothic fiction that inspired this style, right? A lot of the kinds of heroes and heroines that appear in those stories are very stereotypical kinds of characters, right? And this is, again, part of the problem that arises with Gothic novels, is that they become, not only do their plots sort of become stale and predictable, but the kinds of characters that they create become predictable as well. Which is why when you see like the reappropriation of the Gothic by later, more romantic writers, the things that they're doing with the types of stories that they tell, and particularly the kinds of characters that they have, are quite different to the original Gothic. Right? So if we take a bit later example, like something like Jane Eyre, for example, right? Jane Eyre is the absolute opposite of the normal Gothic heroine. She's tough, she's independent, she's active rather than passive, right? She has all of these qualities that make her the true protagonist, like the true active hero at the center of that book. Whereas if you go back and you read even the Gothic novels that are written by women, like particularly Anne Radcliffe is the most famous of the Gothic novelists, her female characters, they all tend to be passive, weak, they need people to protect them, right? They play this very sort of stereotypical, passive, sort of feminine role. Whereas in this story, is Clara passive, weak, dependent sort of person? She's not, is she? Right? She is presented to us as being someone who is, she's very critical insofar as like she uses her mind to think through things very reasonably. She's very sensible, right? She's extremely intelligent. She does, for whatever reason, stick with this weird guy Nathaniel, even though she probably should have dumped him much earlier. But she's presented to us as being here this opposite of the sort of the passive, weak, irrational sort of heroine that we see from earlier Gothic fiction. Right? And of course, this is particularly thrown into contrast for us by the kind of woman that Nathaniel ends up preferring. Right? And of course, there you can see that they've emphasized the extent to which Olympia is a robot or an automaton by giving her like a nice little wind-up clock on the back of her dress there, right? Now, of course, partly what Hoffman is doing here with the way in which Nathaniel falls in love with Olympia is that this is meant to be kind of dark comedy, right? Is that she, for him, appears to be the ideal woman, right? He's like, I sit there and I read her my poems and I tell her my stories, and she just sits there and she just listens. And she like when she, whenever I tell her stuff, she's just so patient with me, and she just looks at me with the best of like most kind and loving looks. Right? None of that is real, is it? Right? All of it is just in Nathaniel's imagination. Right? So this ideal woman that he constructs for himself, right, that he imagines for himself, it's all fake, right? It's all unreal, to the point where even the other students, right, they realize this at the ball, at the party. That's why no one wants to dance with Olympia, right? Is that they all kind of sense that there's something wrong with her, right? There's something not right about her, something not human about her. And so they sort of like avoid her, and then the conversation that he has with his friend Siegmund afterwards, where he's like, you can't have her, she's mine. And Siegmund's like, no, that's okay, you can have her. She's all yours, my friend. She's very beautiful, I give you that. But yeah, she's not, right? So there's a kind of comedy to the way in which like his friends sort of instinctively realize that this woman is just nothing at all. She's not even really a person. She has no personality, because of course, as it turns out, she is a robot. So we see this in the way in which particularly Clara as well is presented to us. Right, this is on page 102. Where we're given, in the middle paragraph there, we're given quite a long description of what Clara is like. And we're told that, she has a certain sort of physical beauty, but it's not the sort of the stereotypical, classical, most beautiful woman in the world kind of overstated beauty that we see in Gothic fiction. Instead, she has this complicated beauty, right? So her physical body is described in an unusual sort of way, but then it's really, what we're told is really attractive about her, what's really interesting about her is her mind, her personality, right? And so it says, Clara had the powerful fancy, remember fancy being the term in these times of imagination, powerful fancy of a bright, innocent, unaffected child, a woman's deep and sympathetic heart, and an understanding, clear, sharp, and discriminating. Dreamers and visionaries had but a bad time of it with her, for without saying very much, she was not by nature of a talkative disposition. She plainly asked by her calm, steady look and rare, ironical smile, how can you imagine, my dear friends, that I can take these fleeting, shadowy images for true living and breathing forms? For this reason, many found fault with her as being cold, prosaic, and devoid of feeling. Others, however, who had reached a clearer and deeper connection of life, were extremely fond of the intelligent, childlike, large-hearted girl. Right? So she combines within herself, on the one hand, she still is able to be compassionate and caring and loving sort of person, but she's also intelligent and perceptive and rational in the way in which she approaches things, right? That combines these two best qualities. And then, of course, we have the sort of ironic foreshadowing of this, is that when Nathaniel goes back home to visit his family, he gets really annoyed at Clara, and he says to her, then Nathaniel leapt indignantly to his feet, crying as he pushed Clara from him, "You damned lifeless automaton," right? Now we see that Clara is the exact opposite of that. She's a passionate woman. She's she's intelligent. She doesn't want to put up with any of the sort of like mystical nonsense that Nathaniel is interested in. And for that, he punishes her. He calls her an automaton. He calls her cold, and he calls her lifeless, right? And then he turns around and he actually does fall in love with someone who actually is literally an automaton, who has no emotions, who is cold, right? And who, is just a robot, so he's not even capable of caring about him. So there's this constant irony of this contrast between those two figures in the story. Okay, let's turn to our prep sheets now, and let's see what are some of the ideas that you guys picked up for discussion. Okay, let's see. Tian, why don't you begin today? What did you pick up?
I picked the paragraph on page 98.
Mm-hmm.
First to the bottom. First from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this paragraph is important because it implies that Coppelius has something to do with the death of Nathaniel's father.
Mm-hmm.
So Coppelius later turns out that in the Nathaniel's imagination, he turns out to be Greece Coppola. So
Yeah.
it implies that Nathaniel would continue confusing those two figures.
Yes. Yep. So as we see, it's very clear that Nathaniel's perspective on things is not reliable, right? That he is constantly confusing his own imaginary fears and so on as if they are real, as if they are reality. So in much the same way as he projects the idea of the Sandman onto Coppelius, so too in this part we see that he confuses Coppola with Coppelius as well, right? Of course, their names are meant to sound similar to make them connected in this way, even though having two names that are similar does not make you the same person, right? Okay. Gustav?
I took the paragraphs on page 99,
Yep.
the second one. Of frankly confess, it seemed to me that all that was fearsome and terrible of which you speak existed only in your own self, in contrast with the paragraph on page 108, the top, the conversation with a friend, where we see how much she is in love with this doll, with Olympia, and I find it interesting how this contrast is built up between Clara's human rationality and Nathaniel's pure emotionality, but also the contrast between Clara and Olympia, where we see how irrational a robot is compared to a human being, and that the betrayal happens because of the robot, but that he gets help from this
Mm-hmm.
fix of
Yes. Yep. So particularly ironic given that how passionate and emotional Nathaniel is, and yet he is able to have these sort of bizarre feelings for something that is just a robot, that is just this doll. Okay. Sharon?
I chose the paragraph on page 26,
Mm-hmm.
where he talks about the Sandman.
Yep.
And then when he talks about how the Sandman would throw a handful of sand in the children's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a lot of these romantic stories, the eye symbolizes vision, light, sometimes innocence. And I think what Hoffman did was he took a folklore and then he, like he said, he made it very gothic. And in this story, it almost seems like the Sandman blinds the children from the truth, from the light.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what actually happened in the story, because Nathaniel is blinded by a lot of things, and a lot of things stem from his own imagination, and he can't see the truth, the reality.
Yes.
And I think that's important to the Sandman in the story, is that it represents something like a shadow that blinds him from seeing the truth.
When he's a child, it makes much more sense for him to think this way, doesn't it? Right? Like when you're a child, you project all sorts of fantasies onto the world, right? Because it's part of the sort of the immature way that children think, right? So it's perfectly easy for us as adults to, when we're reading this story, we don't think, of course, that Coppelius is a mystical Sandman. We know that there's something else that's going on in this family that's not right, don't we? Like we can sort of tell, okay, this is nothing about like evil Sandman and that sort of stuff. There is like the father has got himself involved in something that is bad, right? And it looks like he owes a lot of money to this guy Coppelius, right? So it looks like he's got himself into financial trouble. And we can also tell that like the relationship between Nathaniel's mother and father also seems to be bad too, doesn't it? Right? That there is some sort of marital problems going on here, right? But because he's just a child in those scenes, he's not able to he doesn't have the maturity or the experience to be able to understand those kinds of things. So he's just like, oh, it's about the evil Sandman, right? So one of the problems that we see that happen with Nathaniel's character is that, like, we have this theme of seeing, as you say here, but he doesn't change from when he's a child compared to when he's an adult, right? So usually, when you go back and you think about scenes from your childhood and you think, oh, now I understand why those people were fighting, or why my friend's parents were going through a divorce or whatever it was, and why there was weird things going on there, right? And you look back at your childhood and you think, oh, now I understand why my parents did this or why that was happening, right? But Nathaniel, he seems to be incapable of that, right? He seems to be sort of stuck in this childhood mystical way of thinking, and that is kind of, if we wanted to see this story as being both a product of and also a criticism of romantic thinking, it's that Nathaniel seems to be someone that is, as I said, who is not only a sort of stereotypical romantic character, but something that Hoffman seems to be making fun of, this kind of character, right? This kind of thought, right? That he's sort of saying, well, it may be poetical and imaginative, but it's also quite immature, right? Kind of like not very adult, not very rational in the way that it thinks. Right? Okay, Justin?
I picked just pretty much page 107.
107?
Yeah. Talking about like when he first meets Olympia.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was important because that's the first time that the reader gets to truly see what Olympia is like. And
Mm-hmm.
before Nathaniel was like fantasizing about what she'd be like, and then when he first sees her, it's like you see her as like a robot. So, but then it's weird because he falls in love with that robot, and like the different characteristics she shows, like how she's always like responding to it.
Yes.
So I thought that was important to the story.
Yes. And of course, it's like, when you look at it, it's kind of funny too, isn't it? Like, he's sort of, he's sitting there holding the hand of this robot and like declaring how in love with her that she is, and she's just sort of like, like, oh, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, tell me more, Olympia. And he just, like, it's really weird, sort of, this moment. And the way in which, like you said, he sort of has these fantasies that she is looking at him with love, and that she cares about him, and that when he tells her his stories that she's attentive, and that when she's dancing with him that she's like, so into being with him, right? So all of this, of course, is his own projection, right? His own fantasy, right? That doesn't actually exist. Right? So of course, this is Hoffman. He's telling us here about, like, certainly this is the way in which, if we think about from our theme of twisted love, this seems to be one of the central problems, right? That leads to problems in love, is that kind of projection of the false ideas onto other people, right? Onto someone that you love, that you can project those sorts of things onto them that aren't real, that aren't realistic, right? So we already saw this a little bit with the Balzac story of A Passion in the Desert too, right? Where we had the false projection onto animals, right? That they are like tame and capable of just being what we want them to be, or of nature of being what we want it to be. Whereas nature is its own thing, it has its own reality. And so too we see here the projection, in this case, of this man onto what he thinks is a woman, right? And how that creates this horrible sort of misunderstanding. Okay, Haeyoung?
I picked 110 second paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
The main character felt it as a dream as he awoken.
Yep.
And this kind of method was also used in previous stories like Young Goodman Brown.
Yep.
And I think
Yes.
this shows that he is torn between hallucination and reality. And author made the end remains open to the reader why use the word terrible nightmare. And I think it makes us think about whether the terrible experience was real or just young Nathaniel's dream.
Mm-hmm. Yes, good. Yep. So as we've seen, dreams often used as a way of like questioning the reality of what we're actually seeing in these stories. So as in Young Goodman Brown, Young Goodman Brown can't work out whether the things that he saw in the forest, whether they were real or whether they were just a dream. We also had, Rip Van Winkle, right? Of course, he wakes up 20 years later, but then he's sort of like, wait, those men that I played bowls with and was drinking with and so on, did I really see ancestors, right? So there's this, the dream is used as this literary function of getting us to question how much what we've seen is real and how much of it is the product of our fevered, in this many cases, romantic imaginations, right? Gets us to think about those lines. Good. Isleta?
I chose on page 96 and page 97.
Mm-hmm.
The paragraph is describing what his name is, Capelius.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important because it kind of sets the foreground for like the way that he acts, like Nathaniel acts towards the story, because the description is very like gruesome and scary, and it also like kind of reflects his childlike mind, because usually children, they feel like that kind of thing, and they always like describe things worse than they actually are.
Yep.
So it kind of shows how he never kind of gets away from this childlike thing, because he's now an older person and he's writing letters, but he's still describing the way that a child would describe something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course, like the projections onto Capelius, like as if you would have like this man that would come to dinner and it would deliberately like breathe on your food or pass his hand over your drink so that you wouldn't you want to have it. Like it seems pretty bizarre, doesn't it? Like it seems like this is a kind of mythology that he's created about this guy. I mean, maybe he was a horrible person, but like the way in which he looks at it is very childish, very, very fantasy style. Okay, Eleanor?
I chose the section where he meets Olivia at the party, her coming out party.
Yep.
Specifically the part where he asks if she loves him, and she just is like, and then he replies like, oh, you are my lovely, glorious star of love. At that point in the story, I kind of thought that instead of Olympia being the object of his passion, she's more like an accessory to Nathaniel's passion.
Mm-hmm.
So he is maybe overcompensating for the fact that he's estranged from Clara, and so he goes with Olympia instead and kind of pushes all this stuff on her just because she's there.
Yes. Yeah, and notice the word that the terms that used. It says this is on 107. In the middle there, it says, what a profound soul you have, he's saying to Olympia. My whole being is mirrored in it, right? And there's this sort of sense that like, he's saying, oh, I look at you and I see myself reflected back, right? And of course, this is, something that lovers could say to each other, but of course, when we learn that actually she doesn't have any soul to be mirrored back at him, he really is seems to be just treating her like a mirror. He's like, oh, look at how handsome I am. Look at how much I'm in love with myself rather than with someone else, right? And that becomes what is equally sort of weird and twisted about this story. Yeah. Namhe?
On page 108.
Mm-hmm.
In the second paragraph, here we see that Nathaniel was reading his works to Olympia.
Mm-hmm.
Olympia was just sitting there and listening and barely giving any kind of response to Nathaniel. And the reason why I think this paragraph is interesting is because it makes very strong contrast between Olympia and Clara.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the early part of the story, we see that Clara was kind of disagree with the Nathaniel's opinion and ideals of the existence of the Sandman. So as a human being, yeah, Clara is able to think, is able to be emotional, which the Olympia can never do. But somehow Nathaniel falls in love with Olympia. It seems like the really thing that he needs is someone. It doesn't need to be someone, something that just listen and obey him. And this kind of manlyhood of Nathaniel makes him kind of very subject, and maybe another factor that causes his twisted personality.
Yep.
And twisted mind.
Yep. So this passage here, it's meant to be a mirror back to that passage that is quoted there on 104 that I put up on the slide, because it's like here he reads his poetry and his writings to Olympia, and he imagines, oh, she's so attentive, she'll just sit there for hours and listen to me, right? And he just accepts that it must be because she's so in love with me. But when Clara doesn't like what he has written, then he calls her an automaton, right? And of course, the irony is that she actually is a real human being. She is a real person, and it's Olympia who is the actual automaton in the story, right? So there's that ironic reversal too. Now, one of the other bits of comedy that Hoffman puts in there is that after the scandal of the robot of Olympia being revealed, right? Remember, the professor is told, you can't go around doing this. You can't go around putting robots into tea parties. Like, this is not right. How will people know the different? Like, part of what he's saying is like that people are kind of boring, right? People behave like robots. But then the various lovers. This is on 110 towards the top. Several lovers, in order to be fully convinced that they were not paying court to a wooden puppet, required that their mistress should sing and dance a little out of time, should embroider or knit or play with her little pug, etc., when being read to, but above all things that she should do something more than merely listen, that she should frequently speak in such a way as to really show that her words presuppose as a condition some thinking and feeling. In other words, people from this scandal, they start to think, wait a minute, how am I treating my lover? Are we like robots? Like, am I treating her this way? Does she really have feelings? Right? Now, of course, they don't really believe that their lover is a robot, but this is part of the humor of the story, right? Is that they say, like, the way in which people treat each other is that we have this tendency, humans have this tendency to project our own fears, our own desires, our own fantasies onto others, and that this can lead to some very unrealistic kinds of relationships. Okay? So, as I said, when we come to the Balzac story next time, you'll see this taken to yet another extreme, right? The amount of projection, the amount of the ways in which people project their own desires and fantasies onto others in an unrealistic way, and that the problems that creates in how people relate to each other. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you, guys. Please hand in your prep sheets, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you.